Hello everybody, welcome to this DDEX webinar where today we're going to be talking about the identification of venues, and I'll explain what we mean by that as part of the presentation. My name is Mark Isherwood. I'm here with my colleague Niels Rump, and I'm just going to cover the quick overview of DDEX, why we want venue identification, and what we think is a venue. What do we actually mean by that? And then Niels will talk about the reference metadata associated with identifying venues, the various requirements and issues that we've had to investigate, and talk about a prototype system that we're working towards starting on in the new year, hopefully. We have a fairly small group, so if you have any questions during the presentation, please do open your mic and your camera and ask them. I think with such a small group, we can work on that basis. So, as you probably know, DDEX is a standards organization, and we focus on developing standards to create more efficient communication of data along the music industry value chain. And we do that in three ways. The first thing is that we develop message formats for exchange by computers. And basically what that means is determining what data points are required for a particular business transaction. In other words, what does the recipient need to know in order to understand what the sender is actually saying? And that will also include linking different data items together in order to describe entities. And I'll come back to that concept a little bit later on. We also develop choreography, so that is the order in which messages get exchanged, and what the trigger points would be for actually sending a message to a business partner. And then finally, we develop the message protocols, and these are the mechanisms by which the messages actually get exchanged. Up until about the last 4 or 5 years, that's mostly been using secure FTP sites, where we would standardize file naming conventions or directory structures and that kind of thing. But increasingly, with our standards, we are moving towards web services, which is far more automated than using SFTP, and therefore needs more in the way of standardization of very short messages that act as triggers in a choreography. Usually in web services, the choreographies are a little bit more complex. DDEX's standards are pretty ubiquitous around the world. We're now up to 7,600 plus implementation licenses. DDEX itself has very limited firm data about implementations. Obviously, we know that it's ubiquitous, but we don't know which individual companies are exchanging what messages with what individual business partners. But we do know that if you are operating in the music, certainly the digital music business, and you want to be serious about it, then you really do need to be talking in DDEX and using its standards. And here is a sort of map of the various families of standards that we've got. You can see there each of the sort of generally known roles that different companies play within the overall ecosystem, and the nature of the messages that they're exchanging between each other. We're not actually going to be focusing on any of those today, but on venues. One last point about DDEX is to emphasize the importance of our data dictionary, which contains all the semantics of all the terms in all of the messages and the syntax of the individual messages, and something that we call composites. Composites are sort of building blocks that we use throughout the messages, across all different types of messages, to describe common entities. So a common entity like sound recording needs to be specifically described. And so we create a composite for sound recordings, and that composite will appear in all sorts of different messages, pretty much in the same format. And we use all of those composites as building blocks for our messages. And we do describe DDEX as a lingua franca, and in a way it is a sort of translating system. A sender of a message has to map their data model to the DDEX message, and then the recipient has to map their data model to the DDEX message, so they're actually talking to each other and understanding each other, even though their two data models are different. So let's turn to the concept of venues. Why do we care whether or not we can identify venues? Well, increasingly, it's becoming important. One obvious example is using Alexa. Play Me Jimi Hendrix is set from Woodstock. The only way that the intelligence would be able to actually provide you with that if they knew, among other things, what Woodstock is. Similarly, DSPs are being more and more focused on creating pages that draw consumers in to perhaps discover new music. So they might want, for example, to create a Glastonbury page on their service and encourage people to explore the music that's appeared at Glastonbury Festival over, say, the last 10 years. And then also there are going to be use cases where fans or musicologists want to group music together that all happened in one place. So perhaps a whole series of concerts from the Hollywood Bowl might be something that people would want to do. So those are some of the use cases that we've got for actually identifying venues. And you might say, well, that's easy, we just write it down. Unfortunately not, because one venue may have multiple designators. And here's an example relating to what was originally called the Millennium Dome when it was opened, but has since become sponsored by O2 and gets known as a whole bunch of different things. The O2 Arena, the O2 Arena with the 2 as a lowercase, and a whole bunch of other things, including its address, which is Peninsula Square, London, SE10 0DX. And so that doesn't work for automated processes. Computers can't interpret that information and make proper decisions. So in order to be able to uniquely identify venues rather than vaguely identify venues, you need a proper identifier. And that's what we have been focusing on in the work that we've done in this area, and Niels will get onto that and in his part. But what do we actually mean by a venue? So some are obviously famous. I've already mentioned the Hollywood Bowl in Los Angeles or the Shea Stadium in New York, and obviously a very well-known one is Abbey Road Studios in London. Others are less well-known, Fabric in Hamburg or the Bowie Bandstand in Beckenham. Similarly, some venues are permanent. Sydney Opera House, you're not going to move that anywhere quickly. St Martin's in the Fields Church in Trafalgar Square. Some are much less permanent. So Woodstock, for those who are old enough, Woodstock 69 in New York. And some are sort of in between, because Glastonbury happens every year, but for the rest of the time, it's a farm. So clearly it's not a permanent venue in that sense. Some venues are obviously specially made for music. So the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville is a prime example. But then there's a place called Paris La Défense Arena, obviously in Paris, which is used as a music venue, but is also used more regularly as a rugby stadium for Racing 92 Rugby Club. And then finally, some are obviously big. The Great Strahov Stadium in Prague, the Gorg Amphitheatre near Seattle. Some are tiny. We may need to identify Joe Sixpack's bedroom if something is recorded there and it becomes mainstream. And then some are obviously in between, like Freer Park in Hanley. And then finally, some are what you might call sub-venues, in so much as they're contained within another venue. So the Bell-Bottom Studios near Tokyo have studios A, B, and C, and you might need to identify each of those as well as Bell-Bottom Studios in itself. And then finally, some can even move. So the stage on Queen Elizabeth II, or a mobile recording truck parked in this with Minneapolis, it could be anywhere. So venues can be a lot of different things, and so it's not as simple, as straightforward as you might think to create a venue ID system. And to introduce you to some of the complexities of this, I'm going to now hand over to my colleague Niels, and he will walk you through some of the work that we've done to get things going.
Thank you very much, Mark. Good morning, good afternoon, or good day to all of you. Yes, so we've seen a number of different venues. One type of venue Mark has managed to omit, actually, because some of the venues that we need to address, that we need to describe, are literally out of this world, like the International Space Station. And good luck finding a street address for the International Space Station. So there's a whole raft of different types of venues that we need to deal with. Generally speaking, I think it's fair to say that a venue is any place where music is created or enjoyed. With one exception, it's not about where we're sitting at home in our bedrooms and we're listening to music that comes out of a can. It is really where somebody is creating music, or where there is a live venue where music is being played to a large audience. That might theoretically be from tape or from disc or whatever medium it may be, but it's certainly not the bedroom or the home stereo equipment that we want to identify. Though actually there's a small mistake here. It's not just where music is created, it's where all kinds of media is created. Because it's not just the music industry that has the problem, that has the challenge to identify venues, that has to identify places where music is created, where music is played, where music is made. But it's also the film and TV industries, and that's why we're working with EIDR to build a prototype, hopefully not just a prototype but also an ongoing system, but for now we're looking at a prototype for a venue identification scheme and registry. Who's EIDR, you may ask? Well, EIDR, or the Entertainment Identifier Registry, is basically a registry for identifiers for movies and television programs. It's quite widely used in the area of film and TV programs. It's basically financed by all the major film studios, as well as the distribution channels that deal with films and TV programs. It's based on the Digital Object Identifier System, an international standard for identifications, and does resolution and all of those fancy things that you need for a really good identification system. And as I said, they have a similar need as DDEX. Slightly different. DDEX is more interested in the creation of music. EIDR is more interested in the identification of venues where films are being shown to a larger audience, and therefore that needs to be recognized, identified, or notified, but also a recording studio where films are being made, where TV programs are shot. They certainly also need to identify that. So we're working with EIDR to make sure that we can properly identify these venues, properly describe these venues. Because in the end, there is no real difference between a recording studio where music is made and a recording stage where a film is being shot. Both have the same types of attributes. So what are we doing with EIDR at the moment? Well, there are two work strands, if you like. One is to develop the identification scheme. That's the syntax of the identifier. That's kind of trivial. And given that EIDR is using DOI as the underpinnings for their registry, most likely the venue identifier that we'll be ending up with will be a DOI. But more critically, it's establishing rules and guidance around certain core aspects that any identification scheme needs. What venue is eligible, which ones is not eligible. We've already talked you through a number of different types of venues that we certainly think are eligible. And we also said that some places aren't eligible. So somebody's home stereo equipment isn't eligible. But there are more critical and interesting cases. A recording studio certainly is eligible, and you would identify that, for example, by a street address. I'll come to that in a moment. But what about cases where it's a home studio of somebody, and that person may not want their street address, their home street address, published all over the web? So maybe we need to have the ability to hide, for those cases, the street address from public view. So those kind of data quality, data issues need to be considered. We need to be sure to be able to disambiguate or ambiguate, collate data, different venues together. So telling two venues apart, or knowing that two descriptions of one venue are actually the same venue. That is something that needs to be discussed, that needs to be put down in rules, how to handle that and those kind of things. Persistence. What do we do with identifiers for venues that have stopped to exist? Do we still need to identify, I don't know, the original Globe Theatre in London? Is that a venue that we need to identify? Maybe not for the recorded music, maybe not for the film and TV industries, but maybe there is a reason, because I don't know, somebody wrote a piece of music there, for example, not that I'm aware of. And we need to make sure that the rules about unambiguous identification of a venue are adhered to. But just having an identifier scheme is a good thing, but we want to go one step further and actually establish and build a registry that actually can do the identification of venues, but can then also serve the two industries and all the players in the industries with an API, so that you can actually ask that online database and saying, hey, what is the ID for the O2 Arena? Or what is the venue ID for the music venue on Peninsula Square in London? So these kind of things we want to do. That registry will have to have a deduplication process, and I'll come to that in a second, which will in all likelihood be the most complex thing that the whole registry will deal with. But because there are things like these deduplication processes, which will in all likelihood mean people, there needs to be some finances in place. So the two organizations, DDEX and EIDR, are working on business rules. How much money do we need? What's the financial ongoing cost? How do people pay for it? How does the industry pay for it? And who gets access? Are there different tiers of access? All of those things need to be thought through, and we are in the process of doing that. And with that registry, policies in place, so to speak, we can then start to work on a prototype to put some code in and to populate something with initial data. And we hope to start this work soon. Let me go through some of the more interesting aspects of this work, though, because there are some interesting questions. How do you, for example, aggregate or disaggregate different venue data sets, like recorded at the O2, or recorded on the main stage in the O2 arena, or recorded at Peninsula Square SE10 0DX? Just to have AI to disambiguate those things may work in this case, but it may not always work. So I think there is some need for human interaction and some oversight in these disambiguation rules. Because sometimes, and we've seen that with the O2 already, some locations change their name. It used to be the Millennium Dome, now it's the O2. On its own, the AI will not be able to deal with that unless they know that the O2 is at the same address than the Millennium Dome. But I'm not sure that the street may actually have changed its name as well during the time at that location. So that may not work. And in any case, how does the computer know that the O2 is not a sub-venue of the Millennium Dome, that they are actually the same thing? So that there is need for a person to actually look into some of these things to disambiguate them or to aggregate them if need be. But change is actually the key word here. Things can change, and things do change quite often. So you may have a name of a location which may change, as we said. You may have formal names, or you may have more colloquial names for venues. You may have different IDs and links for venues. They may change over time. And the address may change. And then there may be, especially looking at festivals, you may have a specific stage at a festival, but that stage may only exist for some of the installments of the overall venue / event. All of these things need to be part of the system, and the system and the identification scheme and the rules of the identification scheme need to be able to cater with them. And that makes these disambiguation rules and the disambiguation process somewhat complex. But what do we think we need to identify and describe venues? Name, of course, and location information. And the location information we think will be longitude and latitude, street addresses including subunits and floors. But it's also more generic than that. Geopolitical descriptors will be needed. You may want to group everything that has been recorded in London. That may not be that interesting, but if you have, I don't know, two little places in a small Midwestern town, maybe there is a vibe going on in that town and you want to group them together in a geopolitical descriptor. And then you have just names of well-defined venues like the Bowie Bandstand and the Croydon Road Recreation Ground, or the International Space Station. And then, as many standards have, there's this other equivalent data, just some get me out of jail statement where we don't know exactly how to describe a specific venues. But street addresses alone are a very interesting case. For one, different countries use different formats for street addresses, but then some in some places, street addresses aren't in the way we know it in the UK, for example, where you have a street name, you have a house number, you have a town, and you have a postcode. And pretty much every place in this country can be identified through that. Some street addresses are, it's the third road after the main crossing, or the third road after the railroad crossing, or something like that, are formal street addresses in some places, in some countries. So we need to be able to identify these things and describe these things and be able to store these things properly so that the system actually can handle these. Fortunately, we know a lot about these things by working through some of the examples. In addition to just having the location and the name of a venue, we also then need to have alternative identifiers. Some organizations already have identifiers for venues, and we certainly need to link to them or be able to store them. We already talked about relationships between different venues to some extent. I'll come back to that in a second. That certainly needs to be stored, and we need to be able to store the dates of operation. So when was a specific venue active? But also, when was a specific venue called a specific thing? Because that may also change over time, as we have seen. If we're dealing with disambiguation, and if we're dealing with human disambiguation, we've talked about that before, we know there will be mistakes, but there are things that you can do about that. So if you have two identifiers for one venue, well, it's fairly easy. You mark one as preferred, you mark the other one as aliased, and then you just get on your business. Everybody hopefully will switch to the preferred over time. But if you still use the old one, the system will still resolve the old identifier. You can still use it, and you will end up with a correct venue. It's just not a direct string comparison anymore. If you have one ID, the preferred one, and somebody sends you the aliased one, you can't immediately see that it's the same system, same venue. But if you then ping the system, it will actually come back with a correct one, and you're all set. So there is no proper string fuzzy matching needed, just a call to the API to resolve that. There's a worst case where you have one ID for two venues, in which case you remove the wrong two IDs from the system, or at least one. I would always suggest to remove the two, allocate two new identifiers, and then mark the wrong one as being dead. It's not an identifier. It should never have existed, and you're done with it. So that is certainly an important process, needs to be catered for in the system, as well as in the standard, to how to deal with those things. We talked about venues being relatable or having relationships with one another. So the pyramid stage is a subset of, or a substage of, or a sub-venue of the Glastonbury Festival. Or Studio One is part of Abbey Road Studios, is part of the more geopolitical venue of London. But just because one band was very active in two different locations, such as the Abbey Road Studios or the Roof Terrace and number 3 Savile Row, that doesn't mean that these two venues are actually related to one another. So we don't really care about who was at a venue, who was active at a venue. We only care about the direct relationships between those venues, whether one is part of the other, whether something is co-located, those things, yes, but not just because you have the same people occurring at two different venues. Also of no real interest to us, at least at this stage, is the temporal nature of such links. Either a link exists or it doesn't exist. A venue may exist only at a specific period of time, but whether the pyramid stage was at Glastonbury from that time to that time, that we don't care. Whether the pyramid stage existed for a specific period of time, that is very much important for us. As I said, we don't care who owns a venue. We don't care about who plays or appears at a venue. And we certainly do not want to stop people from registering a venue just because they don't, quote, own it. So I could register Abbey Road Studios into the system. I have no relationship to the Abbey Road Studios. And we don't plan to capture any kind of ownership data because it's not relevant to the identification of a venue. Now, that information may very well be important, and it's also important information about who played at number 3 Savile Row on the Roof Terrace and who played at Abbey Road Studios. Clearly, that is an important piece of information for the music industry, but it's not a critical information for the venue identification system. So we don't really care about that in this context. It's clearly important that venues that have stopped being venues or that have stopped doing music will be retained in the system. Just because a venue didn't stop or stops being in existence doesn't mean that 20 years earlier somebody has recorded some music there, and therefore we need to make sure that the data is retained in the system. And as I said earlier, some venues may actually not have a proper address, or some may have a proper address, but we don't want to publish the information. So, as we've said at the beginning, we are in the process of initiating the work on a trial, on a prototype. We don't know when the prototype will be ready because we're just in the process of starting that process. But one thing we do know is that we need seed data. And if there's anybody on this call or anybody you know that may have seed data, that might actually be something you would want to contact us about, so that we can add the data to make sure that actually the processes, the storage, as well as the API, as well as the disambiguation rules actually work as intended. And also we may need some people to actually test the API in the system to see that it actually works. So some kind of early integration, if you like, with that prototype might be something that could be of interest to you, and it could be interested to us as the somebody who's part of the prototype. We don't know because we haven't fully spec'd out the prototype yet, whether we need that or whether we already have partners that do that. But if you're interested, drop us a line and we might be able to get in touch at some stage. That is, I think, all that we've had prepared. More than happy to take any questions on any of the specifics or the generalities. Otherwise, I'll hand you back over to Mark.
Thanks, Niels. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? Jörg.
Yeah, just kind of recommendation. Hi, Mark.
Hi there.
Hi. Because the collecting societies, they own all those addresses of those places where music is performed. Maybe that's a hint to ask them to give. Maybe they are inclined to give you the addresses of all their performance stages and places, because
sure.
for sure they do have them.
Yeah, that's sure. That's something we're aware of, but obviously what we don't want is we don't need to identify the barber shop on the high street because they've taken out a license to play the radio in the store. So
there's a difference between the concert places and the barber shops, of course.
Sure. Yeah, but definitely those sort of conversations have occurred. We haven't got very far with them yet, but they have occurred. Paul?
Hi, have we looked at the Music Brains data? When I first spoke to Music Brains folks, they said, oh, why don't you use our system? They've not been obviously cooperative in other areas of late, but I wonder if we've looked at ingesting their CC0 location data.
Yes, we have.
We're aware of that, but there isn't any hard action at the moment, but it's not forgotten.
One of the things that we have done in this area is we've collated a number of potential sources, and there are Music Brains is certainly one of them. Quite interesting is the idea of linking up with ticket offices or ticket resellers, because hey, they sell tickets to music venues. Should they know where those venues are? Those kind of things are being considered, and a number of other things as well.
And the other thought I had is we don't, I think, have a liaison with the music managers. My discussions with those managers over the years have just they're very interested in aggregating information about their clients, their charges, disaggregated by the location. So they might be very interested in it.
Okay. Well, we have actually talked to a venue organisation, so but your management as well is something else we should think about. So that's helpful. Thank you.
And just to close the loop on this, there was a project I got made aware of that's looking at historical music society performances and research. They would be very interested in location information for those venues historically. Now, whether there's any business case for doing that is not clear to me, but that should be made.
Well, if you have any contacts, I'm sure we can have conversations with them. Okay. Thank you for attending. I hope you found the webinar helpful. We have recorded it, and in a day or so it will appear on the resources tab of the main DDEX site. Resources and Press, I think, is the full tab name, and the main website is ddex.net. If you want to sort of dip into this again at some future point, it should be up there before the end of the week.